The summer of 1884 brought scorching heat to the Arizona Territory, turning the desert into a deadly furnace that killed the unprepared and unwary with merciless efficiency. But for Tom Dalton, a 36-year-old rancher living alone on the edge of civilization, that brutal summer would bring something far more important than survival, a chance to prove that family isn't always born from blood, and that sometimes the greatest blessings arrive in the most desperate circumstances. Tom had been running the Desert Springs Ranch alone for 8 years, ever since his wife died in childbirth along with their stillborn son and left him with 3,000 acres of harsh land, 200 head of cattle, and a grief so profound he'd convinced himself he'd never want family again. He told himself he preferred solitude, that isolation protected him from the kind of devastating loss he'd experienced, that working until exhaustion was better than lying awake at night remembering what he'd lost. But on a blazing afternoon in late July, when temperatures reached 115 degrees and the desert shimmered with heat mirages, Tom's carefully constructed isolation was shattered by something he never expected to find on his daily inspection of the southern fence line. A woman lay collapsed in the shade of a scrubby mesquite tree, her torn dress and blistered feet telling the story of someone who had been walking through the desert for days without adequate water or protection from the sun. But what made Tom's heart stop and his breath catch in his throat was the unmistakable swell of advanced pregnancy visible beneath her dust-covered clothing. This woman wasn't just dying of heat exposure and dehydration. She was heavily pregnant, probably 7 or 8 months along, and both she and her unborn child would be dead within hours if he didn't act immediately. Tom dismounted faster than he'd moved in years, his rancher's instincts overriding the emotional paralysis that had gripped him since his own wife's death. He checked the woman's pulse, weak and thready but present, and immediately began the emergency treatment he'd learned from years of frontier survival. "Stay with me," Tom commanded, his voice rough from disuse but firm with authority. "I'm going to save you and your baby, but I need you to help me. Can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, brown as the desert sand around them, filled with desperate hope and fading strength. "My baby," she whispered, her hand moving protectively to her swollen belly. "Please, save my baby." And that's when you realize this isn't just about rescuing a stranger, it's about a man confronting the grief he's been running from and discovering that sometimes the family you've lost can be honored by saving the family someone else is about to lose, which is exactly why you should hit that subscribe button right now. Because watching how this grieving rancher becomes a father by saving 2 lives will prove that the deepest healing comes from choosing to help others despite your own unhealed wounds. Tom worked with focused intensity born from desperation and muscle memory, carefully moving the unconscious woman to the shade of his horse, giving her water in tiny sips to prevent shock, and wrapping her sunburned skin in dampened cloth to begin lowering her dangerously high body temperature. All the while, he was acutely aware of the life she carried, the swell of pregnancy that reminded him painfully of his own wife in her final months, the baby who might die before ever drawing breath just like his son had. But Tom pushed the painful memories aside and focused on the immediate crisis. This woman and her child were alive right now, and keeping them that way mattered more than his grief or his fear of facing another loss. Through sheer determination and the woman's stubborn will to survive, Tom managed to stabilize her enough for the careful ride back to his ranch. He settled her in the guest room his wife had prepared for visiting family that never came, brought in the doctor from the nearest settlement 20 miles away, and spent 3 days fighting to keep both mother and baby alive while the woman drifted in and out of fevered consciousness. On the 4th day, her fever finally broke and her eyes opened with genuine awareness rather than delirium. The first thing she focused on was Tom's weathered face hovering over her with concern, and the second thing was her own hand resting on her still swollen belly, confirming that her baby had survived the ordeal. "You saved us," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved my baby." Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion he'd been suppressing for 8 years. "You're both alive, that's what matters. What's your name?" "Anna. Anna Hartwell." She studied Tom's face with growing awareness, seeing past his rough exterior to the carefully hidden grief beneath. "Why did you save me? Most men would have left me to die rather than deal with a pregnant stranger." "But you haven't seen the most important part yet." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clenched together as he struggled with memories he rarely allowed himself to confront. "Because my wife died giving birth 8 years ago. She and our son both. I couldn't save them despite everything I tried, despite doctors and prayers and desperate bargaining with God. But I could save you and your baby, and maybe that makes up for failing them." Anna felt fresh tears fall at the raw pain in his voice. "You didn't fail them, Tom. Sometimes death just happens despite our best efforts. But you didn't let that tragedy make you walk past someone who needed help. That takes more courage than most people ever find." Over the following weeks, as Anna recovered her strength and her pregnancy progressed toward term, her story emerged in pieces that explained how a heavily pregnant woman ended up collapsed in the Arizona desert. She had been traveling with her husband Marcus to California when he was killed by bandits 3 weeks earlier. The same bandits had taken everything, their wagon, their money, their supplies, and left Anna alone in the wilderness to die because they assumed a pregnant woman was worthless and would slow them down. "I've been walking toward anything that looked like civilization ever since," Anna explained one evening as she and Tom sat on the porch watching sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. "I knew I probably wouldn't make it, knew my baby would die with me, but I couldn't just give up. I had to try to save her." "Her?" Tom asked, surprised by the certainty in Anna's voice. Anna smiled, one hand resting on her belly. "I don't know for sure, but I feel like she's a girl. A daughter who's going to be strong and fierce and brave because she survived the impossible before she was even born." Wait, don't miss what happens next. As Anna's due date approached, an unusual partnership developed between the grieving widower and the pregnant widow. Tom found himself drawn into preparing for the birth despite his terror of reliving the nightmare that had killed his wife and son. He brought in supplies, arranged for the doctor to be available, and did everything possible to ensure this birth would have a different outcome than the one that had destroyed his life. Anna, for her part, saw past Tom's rough exterior and emotional walls to recognize a man whose capacity for love had been buried rather than destroyed by loss. She understood his fear because she shared it, the terror that her baby might not survive despite everything they'd been through, that she might die in childbirth like Tom's wife, that hope was dangerous when you'd already lost everything. "Tom," Anna said one evening about 2 weeks before her due date, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to promise you'll be honest with me." Tom set down the rope he'd been mending, giving her his full attention. "Ask. If something goes wrong during the birth, if you have to choose between saving me or saving the baby, promise me you'll save my daughter. Promise me she'll live even if I don't." Tom felt his chest tighten with the same desperate fear he'd felt 8 years ago when doctors had given him the same impossible choice. "Anna, nothing's going to go wrong. You're healthy, the baby's healthy, we've got the best doctor in the territory standing by." "Promise me," Anna interrupted firmly. "I need to know that if the worst happens, my baby will have someone who'll raise her with love instead of resentment, someone who'll tell her about her mother and her father and the journey that almost killed us both. I need to know she'll have you." Tom stared at Anna, this woman who had crashed into his isolated life and forced him to confront the grief and fear he'd been avoiding for 8 years. "If something goes wrong, and I don't believe it will, but if it does, I promise your daughter will have a father who'll love her and raise her right. But you're going to survive, Anna. You're both going to survive, and you're going to raise her yourself, because that's what strong, fierce women do." The birth came 3 weeks later on a warm September evening, and it was everything Tom had feared it would be: difficult, dangerous, and terrifyingly similar to the night his wife died. Anna labored for 18 hours while Tom paced outside the room, torn between the instinct to run from the potential loss and the determination to be present for whatever outcome awaited them. When the doctor finally emerged, Tom's heart stopped beating as he waited for the words that would either free him from his nightmare or confirm that history was repeating itself with cruel precision. "She's alive," the doctor said, exhaustion evident in his voice. Both of them are alive. It was close, closer than I'd like. But Anna's strong and the baby's healthy. You can go in and see them now. Tom entered the room with shaking hands and found Anna propped up in bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in the blankets his wife had made 8 years ago for a son who never got to use them. When Anna pulled back the blanket to reveal the baby's face, Tom felt something break open in his chest. Not more grief, but the release of grief he'd been holding onto like a shield against further pain. "Meet your daughter," Anna said softly. "I know she's not yours by blood, but you saved both our lives, and I can't imagine raising her without you. Will you be her father, Tom? Will you help me give her the family she deserves? What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what comes next." Tom reached out with trembling hands and took the baby, this tiny life that represented everything he'd lost and everything he might still gain if he was brave enough to try again. The infant opened her eyes, brown like her mother's, filled with the kind of trust that comes before the world teaches caution, and Tom felt his carefully constructed walls crumble completely. "Yes," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Yes, I'll be her father. I'll raise her and love her and make sure she knows how brave her mother was to keep walking through that desert. I'll tell her about her birth father and how much he would have loved her if he'd lived to meet her. And He looked at Anna, seeing not just the mother of this child, but the woman who had brought life back to his dead heart. "And I'll ask her mother to marry me so this family we're building has the foundation it deserves." Anna felt joy and relief flood through her exhausted body. "Yes, Tom Dalton. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll build a life with you on this ranch. And yes, we'll raise our daughter together, the one who survived the impossible and brought us both back to life." The wedding took place 3 months later, with baby Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in a basket beside the altar, while Tom and Anna made their vows. When the traveling preacher asked if Tom took Anna as his wife, his answer carried the weight of promises kept and second chances embraced. "I take this woman who reminded me that grief doesn't have to be permanent, that walls built to protect hearts end up imprisoning them instead, and that sometimes the family you've lost can be honored by embracing. The family life brings you when you're brave enough to try again. I promise to be the father Elizabeth deserves, the husband Anna needs, and the man who never forgets that both of you gave me a reason to stop surviving and start living." Anna's vows were equally powerful. "Tom, you found me dying in the desert and chose to save me when walking away would have been easier. You've shown me that courage means facing your deepest fears rather than running from them, that love is always worth risking despite the possibility of loss, and that families are built from choice rather than just blood. I promise to honor the wife you lost by being the partner you deserve, to raise Elizabeth knowing she has 2 fathers who loved her, one who gave her life and one who saved it, and to build with you a family where grief transforms into gratitude." Years passed, and Desert Springs Ranch flourished under Tom and Anna's partnership. Elizabeth grew into a strong, fierce woman who knew her origin story, how her mother had walked through the desert to save her, how her birth father had died protecting them, and how Tom had chosen to become her father when blood relation would have given him every excuse to walk away. They had 3 more children, 2 sons and another daughter, who grew up understanding that their oldest sister was special not despite her different origins, but because of them, and that families were defined by love and choice rather than biology alone. On their 20th anniversary, as they watched Elizabeth teaching her younger siblings to ride horses with the same patient skill Tom had taught her, Anna reflected on the day he'd found her collapsed in the desert. "Do you ever regret saving me that day? Your life would have been simpler if you'd ridden past." Tom pulled her close, this woman who had transformed his grief-stricken isolation into a life filled with love and purpose. "Not for 1 second. Finding you and Elizabeth didn't just save your lives, it saved mine. You taught me that the best way to honor the family I lost was to embrace the family life brought me, and that sometimes our deepest healing comes from choosing to help others despite our own unhealed wounds. Best worst day of my life, Anna said, kissing him while their children pretended not to notice. Worst, because I thought Elizabeth and I were going to die in that desert. Best because it brought us to you and showed us that sometimes miracles look like weathered ranchers with broken hearts brave enough to try loving again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the family you've lost can be honored by embracing the family life brings you, then you found your home. Subscribe to Wild West Romance Stories for more tales of second chances, chosen families, and love that grows from the courage to face your deepest fears rather than run from them. From desert rescues to family celebrations, every story proves that the greatest healing comes from choosing to help others despite your own pain, and that sometimes the most beautiful families are built from the wreckage of the ones we've lost.